Good afternoon, and welcome to this almost last session of the first day of the symposium. We are running a bit late, and I apologize for the online participants. The previous session was running a bit late, and the organizers gave us 5 minutes more for coffee. And with the 2 delays, we are now 10 minutes past, but we still have another almost 2 hours. I can see that we have somewhere around 20 to 30 here in the room and around 10 online. So I would say not a lot, but if you look at the program, you will see that we are in competition with another 5 sessions. Some of them, I must say, extremely interesting, so quite understandable. This session as well, is also extremely interesting, not only from a policy point of view. This is the session that puts in context the developments around EOSC in the context of open science, and the two combined is at the top of the policy agenda for the European research area. So this is the policy context, and really the purpose of the session is to see where are the mutual benefits, how can the developments around EOSC contribute to accelerate the outcomes of other parts of the Euro policy agenda, and vice versa, how can the EOSC developments benefit from the implementation of the other Euro policy actions. So if you look across the many, almost 20 priority actions for the development of the new era that have been defined for the period 22 to 24, you will see that many of them are of relevance to EOSC in a lesser or a more extended degree. For this session, we have then prioritized which ones we think are closest to be relevant to EOSC developments. And you will see in the program that we have highlighted, in particular, the copyright data and digital legislative and regulatory environment. Well, both at the EU level, but also how then they are interpreted, how they are applied in the national laws and the national contexts. So this morning, for instance, was mentioned issues of interest to EOSC, like how can you text and data mine publications and data? How do you know that this is within the legal framework? How do you have legal certainty when you share your data set? How do you know when your repository falls within or outside of the scope of a certain piece of legislation? The second action that we will be focusing on is the action on reforming research assessment, where again you have connections in terms of EOSC providing the data infrastructure to feed the metrics for the indicators that will be defined in a new research assessment system. And vice versa, also important for the developments of EOSC that such a reformed research assessment system gives the credits, gives the rewards for researchers that practice science according to EOSC as an enabler. And the third one that we are going to focus on is, of course, the one related to research infrastructures. And again, here we know that the link to the thematic communities, including advanced ones around different research infrastructures, are very important. We also know here the importance of course, having this interaction in terms of promoting data management plans, promoting, of course, the fairness of the data sets. So the program, I could mention, of course, other ERA actions, international collaboration, research careers, competences of researchers, things related to skills of researchers in Europe. But as a start, at least, but also you in the audience, feel free to comment on any mutual benefits that you see interactions with the other ERA actions. So the way we have structured this session is in 3 parts. Yes, so the way we have structured it is that we will have a first part to go just a little bit more in depth with the action itself around EOSC, which is the action number 1 of the policy agenda. We will also have a presentation of action 2, which is the legislative environment, action 3 on research assessment, and action 8 on research infrastructures. And to help us with that, we have 4 presenters, 2 here in the room and 2 online, who will give each of you 5 to 10 minutes of insight into these actions. So this will be the first part. In the second part, we have the privilege of having with us 3 experts from the community. We have online with us Thomas Magoni from the Faculty of Law of KU Leuven in Belgium. We have Matthias Bjørnmalm, who is the recently appointed Secretary General of CESAR. And we have with us also Giovanni Lamana, who is a key senior researcher at CNRS, and he's also here in his capacity of coordinating the ESCAPE Science Cluster project. So this will be the second part. We will spend probably 30 to 45 minutes on each of these 2 parts, and that leaves a good half hour also if for any questions, either here directly from the room or through Slido, which will be managed by my colleague in the last part. But as far as I understand, Slido is open for questions already now. So even as we go along in the presentations of the different ERA actions, and as we go along also with commentaries from the 3 experts, feel free to ask your question through Slido. So with this introduction, I would like to invite Michel Schuppe, who is the team leader of the EOSC developments within the Commission, to present ERA Action 1. Michel, please.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Here is the connections for the Slido. If you have questions, to be posted in real time during this session, and we'll be happy to address them in the last part of this meeting. So, with this, I think I can move to my presentation. Yes, great. So, yes, the ERA Action 1 was a little bit introduced already this morning, so sorry if there is a little bit of repetition. I will try to go a little bit into more details just to make the things clear about this action. As you know, probably open science is really embedded into the Pact for Research and Innovation, which was adopted by the Council of the European Union in 2021. So open science is really at the center of the way we want to do research in Europe. And this percolates into the ERA policy agenda, which was adopted by the Council as well in 2021. And for each of the 20 actions that were identified in this agenda, the Commission has been asked to develop explanatory documents so that the member states and the associated countries and the stakeholders could commit to one or several of those actions. And Action 1, which is entitled Enable the Open Sharing of Knowledge and the Reuse of Research Outputs, including through the development of the European Open Science Cloud, was very attractive to the member states because we have quasi all of them committed to this action. There are 3 outcomes foreseen to be done by end of 2024. So this is an agenda 21-24. And I'm going to detail these 3 outcomes in the next 3 slides. Of course, our aim is to implement this Action 1 together in synergy with other ERA actions. And I'd like to refer to the 3 ones that will be presented in this session. So Action 2 on data legislative framework for research. Action 3 on the reform of the research assessment, Action 8 on research infrastructures. But of course, there are connections between the EOSC and many other actions. There is an international cooperation dimension. There is a dimension related to education and how we can empower higher education institutions. There is a relationship which is obvious with the ERA monitoring mechanisms, so we have to think about synergies between those actions. Now, allow me to go into the details of the 3 outcomes foreseen in the ERA Action 1. The first one relates to the deployment of open science principles and the identification of best practices. Our motivation here is really to move from the current situation to a situation where open science becomes the norm. And to do this, we have a list of actions. We have identified 5 for the member states on this slide, but actually it's an open-ended list because there are many ways to implement open science across the research landscape. So don't see this as an exhaustive list, just as an inspiration provided to the member states to commit to ERA Action 1. So this includes, for instance, mainstreaming open science across national research funding programs. And we try to do this already through Horizon Europe by including the evaluation of open science practices in the excellence, when we evaluate excellence of the proposal, and also when we evaluate the methodology which is proposed to be followed to address a scientific question. We would like to co-develop with the member states and the associated countries a catalogue of open science best practices, and this was again highlighted this morning in the open session. So many practices can be put into this catalogue, from open science policies at national level, like a roadmap for research infrastructures at national level, when they address openness, when they address fairness and the connection to the EOSC. It can range to toolkits provided by the countries to their national research communities. It can be network of centers, competence centers, and so on and so on. So this is, again, it's an open-ended list. We would like to intensify EOSC outreach and engagement. This is one way to do this is to be done through national EOSC tripartite events, and we were very happy that over the last 2 months we had so many of such events involving up to 16 countries. Of course, an event is just a means to an aim. So beside this, we want to engage with the national research communities. We want to outreach the EOSC vision, and we want to support the ministries in those countries to have a strong coordination within their country. And that's related also to the catalogue of open science best practices, because experience in one country can inspire another country. This activity also deals with skills and support to the researchers. So countries are invited to establish a critical mass of data scientists and data stewards. So real support to the researchers. But in addition to this, we probably have to increase the general fair data literacy of all researchers. Not every researcher has to become a data specialist, but there is a minimum level of things to be known, and of course, young researchers are an important target in this case. Finally, we would like to provide tools and data on usage of fair data, usage of open digital objects coming from research, and to document also the quality of those research artifacts. And here, of course, the uptake of persistent identifiers is an important element, because with PIDs, you can really track research objects, researchers, programs, projects, organizations, and you can develop what we call science graphs that allow really to showcase all the interactions along the research process. So this is what I can say in a nutshell for the first outcome we want to achieve by 2024. The second outcome is about deploying the EOSC platform, federating data infrastructures in Europe, and improving interoperability of research data. When I say interoperability, actually, it's not only interoperability, it's also findability, accessibility, and reusability. So all 4 dimensions of the FAIR agenda that we are pushing through the EOSC. These actions include several activities. An activity by the Commission itself to procure the EU node or the EU core of the EOSC Federation. This core will enable the Federation to exist. And it should provide professional services and user-friendly interface to the researchers with functionalities that are available on a 24/7 basis. So really a professional platform for reuse by the researchers. Now, having this EU node is not sufficient. We need to enlarge and expand the federation itself. So there is work with the member states and the associated countries to increase the connection of national, regional research infrastructures to the EOSC Federation. Besides this, we would like also to improve frameworks for interoperability. And we have an EOSC interoperability framework which is based on community practices. Of course, the aim is not to impose another standard. The idea is to really collect best practices by the various communities and push for further adoptions of those practices. Finally, the issue of sustainability, of course, is very important. It's not because you launch a platform that it is sustained. So we have to further investigate what would be the financing models for the data federation, for the core, and for the marketplace of services that would be proposed to the researchers. Lastly, we have a third outcome, which relates to monitoring EOSC contributions by the member states and the associated countries, but also by the EOSC stakeholders, and this includes also the European partnership that we have with the EOSC Association. So the motivation is to assess trends over time of the uptake of open science practices across Europe. And this is required to look at the policies we have today, whether they are impactful, whether they need to be adjusted, and it's useful also to elaborate new policies. So we foresee 4 layers of monitoring in this capacity. The first one relates to the readiness by the member states and associated countries to embark into the EOSC Federation. And this is done through surveys. I think this has been well documented already this morning, so I will not spend more time on this. The second layer is about monitoring progress of the EOSC European partnership. And we have key performance indicators already identified for this partnership. We have 3 general objectives, several specific objectives. We have operational objectives, so a lot of things to be measured to know where we are with our vision. The third layer is about looking at contribution by the members of the EOSC Association. There are more than 170 members in the association. They all contribute at their level along the activities and priorities of the strategic research innovation agenda of the EOSC. So this also requires some monitoring. And finally, we would like to monitor open science in a wider sense, so beyond the members of the association, beyond what the countries do report to us on open science. My last slide is about the international context. Of course, Action 1 has a focus on Europe, but you know that EOSC is global in scope. So we don't want to develop the EOSC in a European silo. Of course, it's already a multilateral initiative because we have 45 countries already participating to the EOSC, either member states or countries associated to the Horizon Europe program. But we would like to go beyond this. Any standard or protocol we would like to implement in EOSC, in a way, has to be validated with the international research community. And we usually do this through the Research Data Alliance. It was also mentioned this morning that the Commission has a seat in several international fora, and that's also a way for us to expose what progress we have in EOSC in the international scene. So this is true for the G7, it's true with the United Nations Environment, it's true with the OECD, for instance. Last but not least, let's not forget the principles we have in the rules of participation of the EOSC. Some principles are directly tailored to international collaboration, so this includes openness, but also reciprocity. It includes also compliance with digital sovereignty, in compliance with relevant EU and national legislation, and compliance with interoperability and the FAIR principles. So these are things that we would like to apply in EOSC, also with third countries. I think with this, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michel. And indeed, with the last slide, we saw already one connection, which is with the Area Policy Action on International Collaboration. It's number 11. The link also with number 8, which is research infrastructures, was also very evident from your presentation. Now, there are 2 other actions that we have highlighted, at least for this first part, and these are actions 2 and 3. Where maybe the link is not obvious, at least from the outset. So let's start with the second one, which is about analyzing the EU copyright data and digital legislation to make this framework more fit for researchers and research organizations. And to introduce that, we have with us online Alea Lopez de Saint-Romain, who is leading this action from the Commission side. Alea, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me properly?
We hear you perfectly, but we don't see your slides yet.
I'm going to share my screen. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you online, remotely, to present our work on ERA Action 2. So this action is about proposing an EU copyright and data legislative and regulatory framework which is fit for research. So it's about EU copyright and data legislation and the related regulatory framework. What are the main outcomes that we aim to achieve under this action? So first, to identify the barriers and challenges to access and reuse of publicly funded research and innovation research and of publications and data for scientific purposes. So barriers and challenges for access and reuse of what is resulting from research and what is needed, publications and data needed to produce this research, and also to identify potential impacts on research. How? Through an analysis of relevant provisions under EU copyright and data legislation and related regulatory frameworks, and also an analysis of relevant institutional and national initiatives. And on the basis of this identification, The second main outcome of this action is to propose legislative and non-legislative measures to improve the current EU copyright and data legislative and regulatory framework. And what is the overall objective of this action? Why are we doing this? Because a European research area in which scientific knowledge and technology circulate freely, as envisioned in Article 179 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, implies that scientific outputs are accessible and reusable, but also that access and reuse of data for research purposes is supported. And this is very much linked, of course, with the purpose of EOSC. And for that, an adequate legislative and regulatory framework fit for research is a necessary condition to deliver on this objective. So legislation is one of the many fronts on which we are pushing and advancing towards open science, having a right legislative environment, right legislation to support our ambitions and the ambitions of the open science community. This action also responds to some of the concerns that have been expressed by the stakeholders. For example, Rector Karen Max, in the Dies Natalis in January 2021, expressed the views about and the calls to protect independent and public knowledge, and even called for a Digital University Act, expressing some concerns about, by then, the upcoming Digital Services Act. There have also been press releases, statements such as, for example, Science Europe, which role for research in the Future Data Act, CESA, COAR, LIBER, or LERU, expressing concerns about this complex, what they feel as complex regulations or legislative environment that is increasing and in which they feel the research perspective is sometimes either or neglected or not considered. So in response to these concerns expressed by the stakeholders, also we are pursuing this action. And what are we doing in concrete terms? When we talk about data and digital legislation, you can see on the screen some of the main legislative instruments which are concerned that we are analyzing, that are part of this analysis. For example, the Open Data Directive that was adopted in 2019, but which transposition was due in July 2021. The Open Data Directive that deals with public sector information and, very importantly, introduces an article on research data, Article 10. For example, by this directive, Article 10, Member States are obliged to adopt open access policies with regard to publicly funded research data, following the principle, of course, as open as possible, as close as necessary. And also this article says that publicly funded research data that has been publicly available shall be reusable for commercial and non-commercial purposes according to the conditions set in the Open Data Directive, therefore very relevant for research. Another piece of legislation that we are also examining is the Data Governance Act, which, amongst others, also covers certain categories of protected public sector data and fosters data altruism across the EU, also being of relevance for research and research organizations. Another piece of legislation, being part of the analysis, is the Data Act. The European Commission proposal was published in February 2022, and now it's up to the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council, who are going through the legislative procedure through it. The Data Act mainly deals, in contraposition with the Open Data Directive and the Data Governance Act, of the main provisions under the Data Governance Act. The Data Act focuses on privately held data and regulates business to business, business to consumer, and also business to government data sharing, with some provisions that are relevant for research, and an article specifically on research. The Digital Services Act is another piece of legislation that can be relevant for research, in particular with regard to intermediaries. It regulates the obligations of digital services that act as intermediaries, setting due diligence obligations and liability exemptions. Our scientific repositories are in or out of scope of the Digital Services Act is one of the many questions that research stakeholders have been asking with regard to the DSA. And with regard to EU copyright legislation, some of the main instruments concerned by our analysis are the Database Directive. Of course, no need to say how important databases are for research and also resulting from research. The Database Directive seeks to provide legal protection for databases under copyright, but also via the sui generis right protection. There is an exception for scientific research, Article 5, so an analysis of how this regulation affects databases for research purposes. Also, the Information Society Directive, under research exceptions under this instrument, or the DSM Directive, the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive, and the exceptions for text and data mining, or the exclusion of scientific repositories from the scope of Article 17. This is just some examples of the main provisions that we are examining under those pieces of legislation in EU copyright and data and digital legislation. So as I mentioned before, two main outcomes: the identification of barrier, challenges and potential impacts of EU copyright and data legislation on research, and the second one, the proposal of possible legislative and non-legislative measures. Concretely, the first main outcome, this identification, is resulting in several other outcomes for independent expert studies on EU copyright and access and reuse of publication and data and digital legislation and the impact on research that were published in August this year. We also organized 2 online workshops in June 2022. We are keep on gathering evidence and meeting different experts in this field, and we are finalizing this identification of barrier, challenges and potential impacts on research by the end of the year, early next year. We aim at having a study to assess the impact of possible legislative and non-legislative measures in the field of EU copyright and data legislation, because the current identification that we are finalizing also includes, on the side of the experts, for example, if you have a look at the 4 experts that we published over the summer, there is an identification of barrier and challenges, but also recommendations provided by independent experts of possible legislative and non-legislative measures to address the identified challenges. So we plan on having a study to assess the impact of possible legislative and non-legislative measures. We are also expecting to have some guidance for research organizations on EU data and digital legislation, and preparing the proposal of potential legislative and non-legislative measures. Possible measures could include, for example, compiling research-related provisions in a structured way, providing guidelines regarding the application of relevant legislative instruments, specific legislative instruments, initiatives, for example, making the research exceptions in copyright legislation mandatory, or maybe considering the introduction of an EU secondary publication right. There are 5 member states in the EU that have already introduced copyright amendments to introduce secondary publication rights in the national legislation. So maybe considering the possible introduction at the EU level, or maybe the sectoral directive and or a regulation amending existing legislation in the form of a digital research or knowledge act. So those are just possible measures to be considered. So thank you very much for your attention, and yes, I remain available for questions, I think afterwards, after the next presentations and the comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alea, and as you can see, another quite technical file, but not in the sense of technical that we understand under the EOSC action.
Michael, you're muted. For us.
So I will repeat for the online audience. What I was saying was that this is another technical, deeply technical action, but using the word technical in another sense that we use for Error Action 1. So thank you very much, Alea. It indeed shows the complexity of the file. Not only for researchers and engineers and scientists, where it's definitely very complex, but even as a lawyer, even legal experts have difficulties in navigating the very rich landscape of legislation and frameworks applicable. And in addition to that, we have them decided at EU level, and then you have them interpreted and applied sometimes in different forms at the national levels, which of course leads to divergences, it leads to uncertainty, and this is what we're trying to clarify now, as you heard, through expert insights, workshops, identification of various possible measures this year, and then a further in-depth study next year on impacts of each of these possible measures. So thank you again, Alea. And we'll move to the third action, which is about reforming research assessment. And for that, I have another distinguished colleague, Javier Lopez Albacete. Javier.
Thank you. So where are the slides, by the way? It's in the... So this is Michel's presentation. Where are these?
It's here.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I will try to give you a nutshell presentation on ERA Action 3, which is the reform of research assessment. Well, before going into the details of or the state of the art about this action, let me first share with you some of the main motivations to actually rethink and change the way that research is evaluated. Of course, here the viewpoints vary. Different stakeholders look at this problem from a different optic, but these are rather agreed motivations. The first one is that, well, the scientific process is changing. There is a digital transition that is ongoing. The questions that are being asked by science are more and more complex, and this typically requires teams and collaborations. So there is need to incentivize collaborative and open science in order for the research work to be successful. On the other hand, the demands on science to contribute to deliver solutions to societal problems is also increasing. And this requires that science deliver a rather varied set of outputs beyond publications. To date, most of the evaluation practices put an excessive focus on publications. That is how researchers are typically measured, or their performance is measured when they undergo evaluations. Again, and this excessive focus on publications disregards many other valuable contributions of researchers, in particular open science practices. Moreover, not only publications receive an excessive attention, but often they are judged or assessed according to inappropriate uses of quantitative indicators, like the journal impact factors, H-index, and alike. That is a problem because it rewards quantity and speed. It has induced the culture of publish or perish that is well known in the research community, and that is a blocking factor for collaboration because researchers prefer to block or secure publications that allow them to advance in their careers rather than very early sharing that could put that at risk. Okay, so these are three main motivations. Another one is, of course, to foster a more attractive research environment and more attractive research career by reducing excessive competition that is present in the present environment. But all these changes, there is a lot of agreement that they should support the quality of research. That is the overarching principle behind the reform process. So, the process to reform research assessment has been set up as a highly collaborative one. Let me make a remark here. It is clear that unlike the Action 2 that Alea was presenting, reforming research assessment cannot be done top-down or via a legislative initiative, but because it requires a cultural change. And for this to be successful, you need to really involve the whole community, research community at large. Therefore, the process for the reform has been devised as a bottom-up or a stakeholder-owned process. First steps were taken already in 2021. It was after a long consultation round on what should be the main principles and the main direction to actually act on this, to reform research assessment. And this round of consultations resulted in a scoping report that was published in November 2021, and that includes the main principles that should guide the reform movement and sets out also a way forward for implementation. Since the beginning of this year until July 2022, we, the Commission, together with many other stakeholders, we have been working in drafting an agreement that lays down concrete commitments and other elements for the reform process. What I want to highlight here is that in the drafting process, over 350 organizations have been called to provide their input and to make suggestions to this document. So it has been really a truly intensive co-creation exercise and truly inclusive. Like I said, over 350 research organizations have participated into it. But the agreement is only the starting point of the reform. It is a document, I will explain later, that indicates concrete commitments by the signatories and sets out the principles for the work of the future coalition. So, the idea is that research organizations involved with the research assessment, they sign the agreement and then they start the real work in the framework of a coalition where they will have the possibility to exchange knowledge, to work together and to advance together to actually implement the needed changes. So, the state of play is indicated in this slide. As I said, on July the 20th, the agreement on reforming research assessment was published. I will give some details about it in the next slide. Later on, in September 28th, it was opened for signature in a ceremony during the RNI days. It was a ceremony conducted by our commissioner and our director. The European Commission, we have signed the agreement and we will be members of the future coalition. And we have also signed DORA, which is, as probably you know, it's a related initiative that is very much aligned with the objectives of the reform process. We did that very recently on November the 8th. And now on December 1st, it will take place the Constitutive Assembly of the COARA, which is the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, and that is the one that would lead actually the real work for the reform. Of course, we signed the agreement and we will also participate in this coalition in our quality of funder of research and innovation, mostly. This initiative is getting a lot of engagement from the community. Actually, we have a very good number of signatures today, 206 indicated in this slide. Actually, I checked before the session and we are now closer to 300. So the number is really going up as we get close to the date of the Constitutive Assembly. As you may be able to read, or maybe not from the slide, most of these signatories are actually either universities or their associations. It's almost a 50%. But there is also a good and fair representation of other kind of organizations like research centers or research infrastructures. They make up to 14%. Academies and learned societies, association of researchers, national or regional authorities involved with research assessment, in particular accreditation agencies. There are a few of them, so it's really inclusive and it represents the spectrum, the rich spectrum of different kind of organizations. So if I now go to the core or the substance of the agreement, I will highlight, I dedicated only one slide to it, but I think that the real substance of the agreement is probably in the commitments, what the signatories commit to. The agreement includes 10 commitments. 4 of them, they have been called core, and they are as follow. I will read because I think that So the first one is to recognize the diversity of contributions to and the diversity of careers in research according to the needs and the nature of the research. This is a clear call to go beyond just publications when it comes the time to judge the work of researchers. The second one is about putting the focus on quality and to base research assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation, for which peer review is central, supported, if needed, by responsible use of quantitative indicators. The third one elaborates a bit further on quantitative indicators and calls for abandoning inappropriate uses in research assessment of journal and publication-based metrics, spelling out in particular the inappropriate use and very extended of journal impact factors and H index. And the fourth core commitment is about the use of international rankings in research assessment, precisely because they are fed by these kind of inadequate indicators. The agreement also includes 6 supporting commitments that are to enable or to move towards new criteria, tools, and processes, and another 3 commitments to facilitate mutual learning, communicate progress, and to make sure that the new approaches are evidence-informed. Okay, so these are the commitments. Let me make a few considerations. First of all, I think it's clear that the reform process is a clear enabler for collaborative and open science. The second remark I'd like to make is that while this initiative is European in origin, it's global in the scope. And actually, organizations involved with the research assessment forum across the world are invited to join. They can sign the agreement and they can participate in the work of the coalition. Also very important is that the work of the coalition is non-prescriptive. So one basic principle is to respect the autonomy of organizations. So the coalition is offered as a tool, as a place where you can actually share knowledge, exchange best practices, get inspiration, etc., but you are not obliged to go back home and do as you were said in the coalition. The agreement also includes a time frame, which is rather generous, so to say. There is the agreement to report after years 1 and 5 after the signature, to report on the progress that your organization has made. But this reporting is made on self-assessment. Also, since this is a forward-looking initiative, the agreement makes a special attention to the involvement of young researchers, because those would be the ones that would see the fruits and the result of this long-term initiative. And then about the coalition, it is foreseen as communities of practice, namely community-driven, as I already explained, and as I said, offering a space for mutual learning and collaboration. And the specific topics that the coalition will address will be decided by the members of the coalition. They are not defined a priori. So, I have made emphasis that this is a community-driven initiative, but of course this is an ERA action too, where we discuss it in the framework of the ERA Forum with member states, associated countries, and other stakeholders. This action has received a very strong support from member states, 22, 3 associated countries, and 13 stakeholders. One of the outcomes of the action in the framework of the forum is to perform an analysis of the legal and administrative barriers for the reform process. Many organizations claim that they would like to move forward, but they are limited by the framework conditions, whether legal or administrative. So we will work in the framework of the ERA Forum to analyze them and to support the establishment of national framework conditions that actually facilitate the changes. And I said before that the Commission will act in the quality of policy of a funder of research and innovation in the coalition, but we will also intend to provide the link between the work of the coalition and the national authorities as represented in the ERA Forum. Okay, and I finish with that. I would just like to invite you, those that have not done so, to go to the COARA website, read the agreement, which is a short but I think that very comprehensive document, and of course invite your organizations maybe to consider the possibility of joining. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javier. A very important action, and of course also an action that goes well beyond open science and really promotes rewarding what we value in research, and of course at the end of the day it's quality and its impact of the outputs. One last presentation of an action, of course, which is also very closely related to the EOSC action. It's the action on research infrastructures, and to tell us more in detail about that we have with us Agnès Robin, who is from the Research Infrastructures Policy Unit of the Commission. Agnès, you're online.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very clearly. And if you can share your slides.
I'm going to share it. Thank you. Good afternoon, everywhere. I'm just going to share this. Let me know if you see something.
Yes, we see it.
And
if you can enlarge it, it's even better. Yeah, great.
Can you see it?
We see it very clearly, yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
So let's start. So it's about Action 8. It's one of the 20 actions. You have seen that, I think, several times. Maybe I should remove this. Yeah. So it's Action 8, and I would say it's one of the actions that is very closely linked to the action related to open science and EOSC. Here you have the details of the different activities and the expected outcome of this action. I hope it's large enough. So the first important aspect is a strategic analysis of the European research infrastructure landscape. It's linked to the S3 roadmap, which is also listed here. If you are familiar with the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures, you are also familiar with its roadmap, which is listing the priority pan-European research infrastructures needed for the coming 10, 20, or 30 years or more. And in this roadmap, you also had a part of this report that was an analysis of the landscape of research infrastructures. So it has been decided that it should be more strategic, and in particular, it should be decoupled from the roadmap. We start first with the strategic analysis of the landscape, and then we can move to the roadmap in a second time step. What is important is that there is also the objective to change the methodology to have a more strategic, more user-driven analysis of the complete research infrastructure ecosystem, not only focusing on the pan-European one, the S3 one, but going much more in detail and making the link with the regional and national rich landscape. Also focusing more on the services and on the impact to the broader policy agenda. So the idea is to really identify the trends for the coming 10, 20 years or more. What are the needs? What are the gaps? What are also the different dimensions? Not only the infrastructures, but also the type of information, data, services that they could that they are offering. Also the technologies that are needed by this infrastructure, what are the needs, the evolution of the need in the future. Also trying to capture the different cost-cutting aspects, such as the greening of the infrastructures themselves, their digitalization, how they can address the crisis, develop interdisciplinary aspects, and so on. And also themselves contribute to the green and digital transition and so on. So quite a number of aspects, much more complex than the landscape analysis that was performed until now. A bit ambitious, so we'll see how this will evolve, but lots of work for S3 in this work plan for the current years and next year in particular. So that's the first point. Another important aspect of Action 8 is really trying to improve again the access, opening, making the access broader, more sustainable for all European researchers. This is also covering different aspects, different levels. It means that we try to better identify the needs with regards to the facilities, the infrastructure, but also the data, the type of broader services that can be offered. So access in the broad sense. This also means identifying different user categories, different aspect, dimension of the access, legal aspects, institutional, also financial aspects. Technological aspects, for example, type of access, virtual, remote, physical. What are also the access policies in place, how it should evolve, how multidisciplinary needs are covered, whether it's possible to identify the really tailored access mode for certain categories of users. So identifying these categories of users, but what are their needs? For example, specific needs of industry, of SMEs, And as already mentioned for the landscape analysis, how better address the digital and green transition. So that's really a second important element of the action. Depending on the outcomes, the finding, we expect that there will be a need to revise the European Charter of Access to Research Infrastructures. We anticipate in particular that these guidelines and principles that are presented in the Charter could be more detailed with regard, for example, the digital aspects, because it's quite restricted now in the current version, and also maybe better address access related to category of users such as industry SMEs and in particular intellectual property aspect and so on. The third main element of the action is, of course, the roadmap itself. So that's, as mentioned, it would be in a second step after the landscape analysis has been completed. And associated to the roadmap, it's not only identifying new pan-European infrastructure, but also to support the one already in the roadmap. And for that, a new monitoring framework to assess the performance of the infrastructure is being developed and tested. And the idea is not to evaluate the infrastructure as such, but rather to have a tool to support their implementation and to guide for ESFRI to guide their implementation. Another element is the ERIC legal framework. So this is a ERIC Council. This is a Council regulation adopted in 2009, and since 2009 we have now 25 ERICs already in place. Almost all of them are actually flagged as a priority in the ESFRI roadmap. And the majority of them are actually distributed infrastructure. So it's important to take stock of this landscape, of this development, and to see if there are recurrent issues that should be addressed in the implementation of this legal framework, and to try to identify some dimension like the greening, the digitalization, and how this the ERIC framework is able to capture that, support this aspect, and if there are some even need to amend this regulation. So that's not the objective, but that's something which we don't exclude if needed. And the last part, I would say in the context of EOS, is quite important. It's the cooperation between research infrastructures, between research infrastructure and e-infrastructures, and also the engagement of stakeholders, including through the EOSC. And that's really an important aspect of the Action 8. Here I've just mentioned who are the key actors, in particular engaged to coordinate these different elements of the Action 8. Of course, the Commission is leading the coordination related to the implementation of the ERIC legal framework and also the European Charter for Access. ESFRI, which is involving Member States and Commission, is of course leading the development of the next roadmap, the monitoring, and also having many action, I will come back to that later, related to the engagement of stakeholders and other countries when relevant. The member states, in addition to ESFRI, the member states are also involved through the Horizon Europe Program Committee and when preparing a relevant active work program and action under this work program. Of course, we expect engagement of the member states at different levels. For example, they have the one who would provide us with relevant information on the national landscape and facilities, including national nodes of the different ES3 distributed infrastructures. We also expect engagement of associated countries in line with the European Research Area governance. Of course, one of our key stakeholders are research infrastructures themselves, and we are trying to engage them in a more structured and systematic way. notably the S3 landmarks project and ERICS, but not only. We are trying to have a structure dialogue with umbrella organization, be it the ERIC Forum, other association mentioned. And missing in this slide is the engagement of other key stakeholders, and we consider key stakeholders like representative of universities, of industry, and so on, and also other research organizations. Okay, you already had some information on the need to have commitment by member states, associated countries, and stakeholders. And here, just to highlight that Action 8 is also raising lots of support from member states, from associated countries, and from a number of stakeholders. Actually, I will focus on the engagement of stakeholders, so because I think it's important for the EOS communities. So it will continue, but we had, in particular this year, we had many workshops and events and opportunities to engage with stakeholders. I would like to mention, for example, a workshop taking place in March this year, where the main objective was to align the policy aspect on research infrastructure, in particular in the context of S3, and the more programmatic aspect with notably the support under Horizon Europe. So really to identify the needs that they are in line with the priorities and the policy. So that was the first workshop in March, organized by the Commission in close cooperation with S3. And we also have a number of workshops and events organized by S3. So here we had a workshop on the landscape analysis in April, involving the S3 delegate, national expert, the research infrastructure, but also a broader consultation of stakeholders with a particular online survey. And the aim was to identify in particular the strengths and the weaknesses of the recent S3 landscape analysis and how we could improve it and identify the future scope. And also make sure that we agree on what is the intended audience of this landscape analysis. And here you have some more detail on how we structure the discussion during this workshop. There was also a workshop by S3 on the monitoring, also taking place in April, with, again, participants from S3, from S3 working groups, the infrastructures, and other stakeholders. And you see the objective and the rationale of this monitoring exercise and consultation. I'm trying to be quick because I think we are running out. Maybe the most important one, because it's now it will be structuring the dialogue between S3 and all the stakeholders. So S3 has established a stakeholder forums. There was a high-level event in March last year during the S3 days in Paris under the French presidency. But the first stakeholder forum meeting, physical meeting, took place in Brussels in September. And it was a fully booked event with, I think, around 150 participants on site. There was some plenary session and also 4 parallel sessions discussing the specific aspect of climate change, energy challenges, oceans, and also culture. So you can see the different discussions that took place. And it's not just, it's really the idea is that to continue the dialogue, to have a further meeting between S3 and all the stakeholders. So it's really an important point. And I think the EOS community should be strongly involved there. Maybe I can be quick because it's a bit implicit. The expected impact of ERA Action 8 is really to strengthen the research infrastructure landscape, and in particular the service and the access they offer, to be better adapted to user needs, be it for really frontier research, scientific challenge, but also address better the policy priorities, and such as already mentioned, green and digital transition. It's also about the sustainability of the infrastructures themselves, ERICS and the other one, and to also consider the whole landscape and the whole system of infrastructure together, and which how to improve the sustainability of the system itself. So we have discussed access already, and including through the EOSC, stronger engagement of stakeholders, and by improving the landscape analysis, it's the idea is to the expected outcome is to have a more robust priority setting, in particular in developing the roadmaps. We rely very much on trying to identify the appropriate clustering. Currently, we are very much relying with large thematic clusters following the different themes of the European of the ES3 roadmap, and also the different clusters identified under the ERIC forum. So really to make sure that this is the appropriate structuring and appropriate clustering, or if we need to fine-tune that and adapt a bit. And of course, the impact, it's in line with the European research area, the new European research area as a whole, to really to have more impact on society, on the economy, and on the people. And that's it on my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Agnès, for giving us all these details. As you could see also, this is very much also involving collaboration between research infrastructures, e-infrastructures, and other stakeholders, including through EOSC. And the action before that, you heard Javier saying that this is very much, again, a stakeholder-driven initiative. So I can see that there are 4 questions on Slido. This is very good, and we'll come to these later. But first, as I said in the beginning, I would like to thank again the experts that we have with us from the stakeholder side, Thomas Magoni, Matthias Björnmalm, and Giovanni Lamanna. And let me start with you, Thomas, who, as I said, is from the Faculty of Law at KU Leuven, to provide your comments on what we have heard in terms of the other actions that are relevant for the EOSC developments. How can EOSC benefit from these developments, and vice versa? How can the developments in EOSC help with delivering the outcomes of the different actions? Thomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here with you, even if only digitally, to develop this conversation. So I think that EOSC is certainly in a position where a deep perception of the evolving field of law that Alea, Michel, and others have outlined is absolutely necessary. This is a complex and fast-evolving framework. As we saw, it started as far back as 1996 with the database directive, but it's still in full development. And in fact, one of the latest proposals, the Data Act, that is so relevant, is still at the drafting phase, even though in a more advanced stage. So this is something that for everyone active in the field of research in Europe, and therefore chiefly for EOSC, for what it represents, but for research as such, as an activity for researchers, for RPOs and RFOs, and as well for the values of open science that are so central to the activities of EOSC. It's important to understand that in all these legislative approaches, the role of research is often not as central as it should be. It's true that thanks to the raising awareness of the relevance of research and to the work of some of the people from the Commission that are in this room right now, in more recent legislative approaches, the role of research has taken more centrality if we compare them, for example, with the oldest directives in the field. But however, even in these more recent developments, when we see how research is represented and the needs of research translated into the grammar of legal acts, usually takes the form of an exception or of limited safeguards or safe harbors or on narrowly identified exemptions. So there is a rule that regulates broadly, digital services or data or databases. And then there are very narrowly construed exemptions for research. Now, good that they are, that's an important thing, but it's not enough. And it is not enough because in the constant process of we call it juridification of society. So society gets more complex and we need more laws to regulate this complexity. Even though I'm sure that many will disagree that that's what we need. But it is a fact that society, that there is a process of juridification in society, but this also means a process of juridification of science and of technology. And this development requires and asks us to develop a stronger theoretical and normative approach in this area. And, of course, I'm an academic, so I have to have a strong theory to develop things. But I think it's not only an exercise that is good on paper, it's an exercise that of having a stronger theoretical framework within which we can create free spaces for research, because it will allow us to develop the laws that we are discussing as potential obstacles today, as potential enablers for open science. What form could this take? There are many, but think of an EU right to research, for example. Why research has to be an exception and not a right in its own, the legal expression is in its own right. And Article 179 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU is certainly a formidable tool to achieve this goal. But a theoretical reflection would also allow us to think exactly about what kind of research do we want and do we need to regulate along these lines. Because reducing research only to scientific research implicates certain choices. And these choices usually exclude important social agents from these exemptions areas that are at the core of open science in the EU. Let me give you an example. So Alea mentioned, for example, the text and data mining exception of Article 3 in the Copyright and Digital Single Market Directive. That's an important exception that is available to research institutions for research purposes. However, by framing it like this, it means that journalists are excluded from this exception. When journalists perform research, this exception doesn't cover them. When whistleblowers perform research, this exception doesn't cover them. So what kind of research are we envisioning? Because, put it in another way, the whole field of citizen science is excluded if we reduce research to scientific research. So again, a strong normative analysis of what are the real theoretical implications, I think is a much needed first step in order to then develop the tools that we need in this specific field. And very briefly on the second of the questions that you suggested that we take as guidance for our comment, I think that, again, EOSC in particular is in a key and also in a privileged position to benefit directly from a development of the ERA actions and certainly of the second action, but also has the possibility, the power to indicate the needs and the priorities in a constant dialogue with the co-legislators. And in this case, the possibility to influence the specific shape that ERA action should follow in more of a bottom-up approach. Given the comprehensive nature of and the functions of EOSC, I think that this contribution could be tailored not only at the EU level, so talking to the EU co-legislators, but also and importantly at the national level. We know how research, culture, and even to be very institutionalist, the attributions of power between member states and the European Union are often designed in a way that we could define collaborative. So there are things that member states could already, for example, be asked to do within the current existing legal framework. For brevity, I just give you a couple of examples. We all know that most copyright exceptions are not mandatory, that those contained in Article 5 of the Information Society Directive can be picked chosen by member states, and certain member states include some of them, certain other member states do not include them. But a member state, for example, via request by the national representatives of EOSC, could be asked to implement all the exceptions and limitations that the European framework makes possible. So it's not an obligation, but is a possibility that needs to be grasped. A similar argument for the overridability of exceptions and limitations. We know that often exceptions and limitations can be, or better, EU law says that only certain exceptions and limitations cannot be limited by contract. But it doesn't say that the others must be limited by contract. In other words, member states and certain member states, such for example Belgium, declare that all exceptions and limitations are imperative, so they cannot be limited by contract. So this is another example of what could be done already now to improve this open science landscape for Europe, and an action that would certainly benefit from a leading, let's say, signal by EOSC. There are other similar examples, but just to conclude, in addition to these legislative actions, other non-legislative actions also can be extremely important and are areas where EOSC could and is already to a certain extent playing an important role. And one of these is, for example, the raising the awareness and the professionalization and the creation of skills for the various agents and figures and individuals that work within open science. So to enable not only the researchers, but the broader community that work around open science, because by empowering them with knowledge, is a lot easier to make open science happen. And here, for example, both EOSC and connected projects such as Skills for EOSC, with which I collaborate, are doing a very important work in that sense. So if we combine these two approaches, I believe that so a legislative and a non-legislative one within a strong theoretical framework, I am convinced that the road that the ERA actions are set to pursue will be a successful road that will allow us to reach these goals of a European open science area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Thomas, for these very pertinent comments on the different lines of interaction. Let me now pass the floor to Mathias Bjørnmalm, as I said, the Secretary General of CESAR. CESAR is the Association of Universities that have a particularly strong science and technology profile. Mathias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon and good evening from my side as well, and glad to be here. I was asked to give a 3 to 5 minute feedback intervention on what the main issues are in relation between EOSC and ERA Action 3. As many of you know, CESAR was a founding member of the EOSC Association. The current president, Karel Leuben, was nominated by CESAR, and many of our member universities provide the backbone to the EOSC in terms of hardware, e-infrastructure, etc. And on the other hand, the ERA Action 3 on research assessment, this is also a top priority for our association and our members. And we were indeed in the core group preparing the agreement that was presented, the outcome of it was presented earlier in the session. So for CSAR and for Universities of Science and Technology, there are indeed many interconnections, and I'm happy to share some thoughts here, just a few thoughts around the key issues and challenges and how I see ways to address these. If we start with the direction from Action 3 to Action 1, so this is from research assessment to EOSC, then this reform is vitally needed to unlock the full potential of EOSC. So we think researchers and university professionals being properly rewarded for engaging with data, infrastructures, and services that underpin the EOSC. If we go in the other direction, so from EOSC to research assessment, then here infrastructures, services, and tools, such as those provided by the EOSC ecosystem, are critical for capturing a fuller and more correct picture of what modern research and researchers are and what they do. On one hand, this can do with next generation metrics and looking at a broader type of indicators, going well beyond citation of papers to usage and impact of research outcomes more broadly. On the other hand, I see that EOSC could help us in the piloting and experimental phase of the reform of research assessment, as I think we all agree that these should be evidence-based and data-driven. And if we have a range of initiatives and pilot projects running around the research assessment and QARA, this Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, which we also heard about, then it would be very useful, in my view, to the community, so QARA and also beyond, to be able to find, combine, and reuse evidence in a meaningful way as this evidence pool is growing. And of course, the EOS community has a lot of knowledge in working with data and federating data in that way. So in this way, I think we can manage to create positive and learning feedback loops between ERA Actions 1 and 3. So this is EOSC and the research assessment to the benefit of both. So in addition to these challenges and opportunities, let me now finish with 2 risks that I see related to both of these areas that I hope we can work together to overcome. First, while universities and the broader EOS community should lead developments in this area, we must ensure that action is not constrained by incompatibilities in the funding and legal landscapes. And it was great to hear some of the discussion previously here around legal challenges and considerations there. So it's therefore vital that we combine activities that universities and the broader EOS community do with clear and decisive action at regional, national, and European levels. Second, as the enthusiasm for EOSC and QARA are both growing, and rightfully so, and more people and organizations are getting involved, there is a risk to put an undue focus on risk mitigation here because of the increasing complexity, which too easily translates into rigid and extensive governance structures. Basically, as complexity increases, the gut feeling is too often to clamp down with more governance layers to try to control all of this, which can then actually work to grind to a halt all those passionate individuals who want just to be there to get things done and to engage with the content as they start to see red tape and approval processes everywhere. So instead, I urge us as EOS community and as QARA community and the big overlap that exists between the two, to put quality, risk-taking, and trust at the center of how we operate here. I believe that is how you enable and energize passionate and talented people, which at the end, to me, is the real engine and therefore recipes for success for both EOSC and QARA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Quality, risk-taking, and trust. Absolutely agree with these. Finally, let me give the word to Giovanni Lamana, who is the coordinator of the Horizon 2020 ESCAPE project, one of the science cluster projects that we have. He's also a key science researcher at CNRS. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me? Yes?
Yes,
correct.
We hear you and we see you.
Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for your invitation. I'm happy to attend this panel, although online. So first of all, my comment is that I have been attending some of these stakeholder meetings that Agnes Robin was talking about. Therefore, I look forward to provide more details in the next consultations. But for this section, I prepared my thoughts in a few slides that I'm going to share with you, if I'm allowed. I will do my best. Can you confirm that you see the slide? Do you see them? Okay.
Yes, we see.
Trying to respect the allocated time of 5 minutes. So my duty today is to try in a practical way to think about and share my thoughts with you about how to pursue the Action 8 of ERA by leveraging the Action 1. I start with a preamble. My way to see open science through a threefold objective: support fair data-intensive research, involve fellow citizens in the scientific research process, enhance the commitment of scientists in socioeconomic challenges, and this from all domains. Then the favorite definition here for EOSC, for the mistake, science, research, and innovation data space. The Action 8, my suggestions, practically speaking, about the strengthening of the research infrastructures are 4. Upgrade and sustain ARISE that are already in operation. These deserve longer-term investment for competitiveness. Update structure, terms, and scope of investments for emerging ARISE. Challenge new models and framework for economy of scale and for federating innovation capacities. Adopt a forward-looking approach of ARISE for structural impacts also on regional policies and society, largely speaking. Now, based on these priorities or these examples, I try to share with you 5 avenues to be explored towards a global research infrastructure ecosystem pioneering open science, also through, of course, EOSC. First is the fact that after the implementing the design study phases of the preparatory pre-construction phases of S3s within the Horizon Europe framework, we need also to consider some follow-up action. For instance, updating technologies and widening cooperation actions for S3 already in operation. I give you an example. This can be attractive and important to support the new countries willing to join an ERIC on S3 by taking charge some upgrading or acting to enhance opportunities to access DRI. And this access concerns as well the virtual access to ARISE. Therefore, the digital innovation, therefore EOSC is concerned by this action potentially. Second avenue to be explored. In the past years, the Commission has started to implement, and then is becoming a normal practice, to ask into the design study phase or preparatory phase the request of data management plan. I think we could also envisage to ask the commitment to produce an open science program according to the threefold objective that I presented before. This would imply the gradual alignment of new emerging ARISE into the EOSC ecosystem, as well as the enhancement of researchers involved in EOSC that is a priority. A third avenue, we should invest to support the sustainability of the science clusters through the implementation of corresponding domain-based competence centers. I don't say anything new because we know that we are already see this in the current in the current or future framework, but I make a step forward here. Domain-based competence centers to drive the open science program that I was talking about before in item 2, to leverage the cross-cluster coordination as well as the EOSC core and the EOSC exchange services, strengthening the adoption of commons. And furthermore, the ARISE in a science cluster, therefore in large domains, would second some common functionalities to the competence center that therefore are acting as a science cluster instances delegated to operations. For instance, data management services, user analysis platform, scientific software and workflow catalogs, and finally operate the domain-based data federation. It should not surprise you if you see that those elements are those that we have produced with the science clusters. So this approach avoids the support of repetitive functionalities per each RI, saves single RI funding, avoid single RI spending cuts on software, data, archive, and innovation. Now I talk from the escape, let's say, big science, physics, particle physics, astrophysics, big science projects sometimes due to the budget restrictions are going to cut the most vulnerable items out of the list of expenditure or running costs. And this happens often about data, about software, archive, and so on, and innovation. So the consequence is that immediately we have to invest more for supporting the competence centers. This is really an important need now. And then we have gains by economy of scale because we save budget on the longer term, incentive to a global and continuous innovation in open science targeted to and brought by the scientific community at large that acts as a global open science foundation. Finally, this also implies a booster for the European Union member states, institute and research agencies. First of all, because they are behind the large consortia that develop, deploy, and exploit these big science projects. And this is applicable to any scale, to any RI, to any science cluster. But also behind the competence centers that we have countries, we have national institutes that in any case are always part of this huge international endeavor. And consequently, the RI ecosystem. I conclude with two last avenues. One is the forward-looking approach chart. We have to introduce this because in such a way, we can guarantee the commitment of RIs in socioeconomic issues, both regionally, and here I come back to a suggestion that I provided to one of these stakeholder meetings, that we have to consider to support the host countries as well as those partner countries that are deeply involved in the RIs, and globally requesting to each RI to integrate in their open science program and operated within EOSC. RIs produce research digital objects to be fully articulated with the other sectoral data spaces define the European strategy for data. This should facilitate or strengthen the capacity of RIs to engage through the EOSC with industry, government, politics, and the labor market. Finally, we talk about data coming from the different RIs, from the different disciplines. And sometimes we limit ourselves. I try to make a step forward. EOSC strengthening a legacy technology know-how to accelerate further innovation with and within RIs. Technology and innovation, also produced by RIs R&D published results, have also a series of digital objects. Probably not all of them, but most of them have digital objects behind that potentially are aimed at being fair and managed within the EOSC Data Federation. By putting the accent and the focus on that, this is one more way to foster the articulation of EOSC with the other sectoral data spaces. The Science Cluster Domain-Based Competence Center can be in charge of work out roadmaps, coordination among RIs for long-term technology and innovation prioritization, coordination, direction of research and innovation investment for ERA, as well as their fairness. This is all from my side. And I think that I'm also addressing a couple of the questions that I see on the electronic tool, collecting the questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Giovanni. Very, very useful comments, both for us and for the stakeholders. Indeed, I also see online questions that are relevant, I think, mostly to you. I will pick up a few of them. There's a question: how is fair open source software tools, how could they contribute to the development of research infrastructures? So also, should actions cover also software and methods? I think you already partly answered that through your slides, in particular your third point, but if you would like to elaborate more on this.
I can just comment quickly that anytime we talk about data, we talk about digital objects, and since the beginning 4 years ago, clusters have been always saying software is part of that, and we have worked for that. But furthermore, the question is extremely important, because when we talk about other kind of data that brings each RI to talk with the others and one cluster to the other and commit in the different sectoral data space, we talk also about the software that use for technology as not only a byproduct of the R&D and the innovation plans.
Allow me to pick up one of the other questions. What are expected concrete actions to enhance impact on society? So currently there's an increased danger to deny science and facts. Care to comment on this one, Giovanni? It's a difficult one.
Let me see, which is how the current, no.
It's the latest one.
What are the expected concrete action to enhance impact on society? Currently there is an increase. Yes, I believe this is okay, I cannot develop in details, but in general, this is something that we also have been supporting and also discussing with the research and innovation division of the Commission. I believe that we have to concentrate also about the declination of the global concepts, the global policies, European policies, and the regional ones, because the stakeholders that have a role in the ecosystem often are large laboratories, universities. They have a role locally. They participate, they are partners in the research infrastructures, but locally and regionally, they could also try to pursue their policy, their remit to support science, not only in terms of mediation, scientific communication. We should be able to communicate, but we should be able to involve the society at large in what we do in the scientific research process, and EOSC and the fairness of data provides us a fantastic tool to make that are global, but can be declined to a more local, regional and local action that needs to be more real and less virtual. We can discuss virtually online. In a global context, a regional, we should really open the door or go towards the society. This will be the way, in my opinion, to increase impact of science in society.
Thank you, Giovanni. Let me pick up a question that relates more to Action 2. And it's a question around data altruism, so the voluntary sharing of data for the common good. The question is about what is the status of data altruism as a concept. So I think as a concept, definitely also within the relevant legal acts. Thomas, would you like to make a comment on this concept and the introduction of these in the legal acts? Or Alea as well? You unmuted, Alea.
Alea?
Yes, please, Thomas.
I can briefly say what the Data Governance Act says about it, that so it's the voluntary sharing of data on the basis of consent, of permission, without a reward beyond the compensation to cover the cost, and for the purposes of general interest, including scientific research purposes. And there will be a register established by the Commission, a public register of data altruism organizations, so of course very relevant for research. Thomas, please add as you see about the status, because the question was about the status, no? I don't know if that refers to how it is understood in the legislation, I guess, no?
We will have to ask either the person in the audience. Yes, please. When is it going to be implemented? Is the more precise question.
The exact timeline, do you know, Thomas? I can check.
Yeah, the DGA is in force, so it depends on when it says that it has to be implemented. But I think that there are a number of provisions that member states have to implement, like the creation of independent authorities that will hear, for example, about certain type of requests. So I will imagine that there will be technical times to implement that. But I think that the right thing, the right way to look at it is as one of the key elements of a broader data strategy. So you look at the DA, you look at the Data Act, the DGA, so all the legislation that you mentioned, Alea, in your analysis, and the final output is what also Giovanni referred to, so the creation of a common data space. So if you take all these pieces of the puzzle, the ultimate result that all this legislation is trying to create, and to which the actions of ERA are also functional, is to the creation of a common European space for data in one case and for science and research in the other. But they are quite close. I mean that EOSC will be some sort of European data space for open science seems to me quite clear and obvious. Also, given the very encompassing definition that we have in data spaces. So if you put all these pieces of the puzzle together, I think that data altruism, but with all these other concept of data portability, etc., then you can really grasp the entirety of the design behind that.
Very good. There was a question also related to Action 3, which is about the profile of stakeholders that have signed up. We are classifying the stakeholders in 6 categories. I can more or less remember them, Javier. I can remember the categories, but the percentages between them, I know that there are 40 to 50% of universities, but please.
So what is the question in particular? What is the different percentage among current signatories?
Yes.
Okay, I need to look it up in the slide. To be honest, I remember that almost 50% are universities, exactly. And then there is a more or less homogeneous distributions of the other kind of organizations. So universities followed by research performing organizations, research centers and infrastructures, then by academies, learned societies and associations of researchers, then funders, then others, which is a very broad category for those that do not fit exactly in any other of the previous one, and the very last one with a 3-4% is national or regional authorities engaged in research assessment activities.
Exactly. So this is the breakdown that we see currently have signed up.
If I remember the graph correctly.
You're right. This is also what I remember. But of course, this is a moving target. Signatures are open. It's open for signatures on a continuous basis. So this will evolve, but it's likely to be at least 1/3, if not more, populated by universities or their associations. Let me pick up also, since I see, Thomas, you're still on the screen, a question related to legislation. And it's about the link in particular between data legislation and the NIS2 directive. So the NIS2 directive is the Network and Information Security Directive, which is from 2016 and is now being updated in the NIS2 directive. So it's about cybersecurity. So the precise question is, how do you think EU data and the NIS2 directive, still to be adopted, can live together?
I must say I have no idea. I don't really cover cybersecurity very much, so that sounds like a very interesting question that for someone else or that I will need to research.
Yes. Alia?
Yes, same here. so not part of the current scope of analysis, but a very good example of how many different pieces of legislation can have an impact and can be relevant for data research purposes. So of course, it could be very interesting to know, but I don't have a response to that.
Okay. Let me instead take, I don't have the question here, but I remember the question was about the link to the Brno Declaration. So this was the declaration from 4 weeks ago at the ICRI 22 conference in Brno, also here in the Czech Republic. And yes?
Yeah, thank you. So the link to the declaration in Brno is really the global dimension. So actually, the Brno Declaration was quite exhaustive of the different scale of the research infrastructure ecosystem, trying to make it more coherent with the local, national, regional, European, and other regions. So really to have to consider the whole landscape to make it more coherent, more effective, to address some of the key stakeholders. And that's part of the landscape analysis actually under Action 8, that we try to not focus only on the European dimension, but take into account the other at the smaller scale, because the landscape of research infrastructure is very rich at national level, but also the global priorities, what is going on at global level, and what are the global challenges and how to address them. So that's part of the landscape. And also the engagement of stakeholders as well, of course.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Agnes. And I think with this reply, I will again thank the experts for their participation. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the meantime, 2 of them had to leave, but we will thank them personally after this. Thank you also to the presenters of the different actions, and thank you to the audience, both online and in this room. Have a nice evening. Bye.